Good afternoon. As people start trickling in, we're going to quickly run our spring meeting 2023 conference video. Hopes that you'll be interested in this. Good afternoon. ULI prepares to welcome 4,000 international experts from across the real estate and land use industries to Toronto next May 16th to 18th. This is your chance to make valuable connections to the international real estate and development market, listen to unparalleled speakers, and join our exclusive tours. To learn more about the ULI 2023 spring meeting, the link you can see has now been put into the chat. We also would like to just flag that this is a great time to become a member of ULI if you're not already, and if you are already, to use your membership to its fullest. There's a number of really incredible values, and this slide just mentions a few of them, including access to our global membership directory, networking through our navigator process, and the behind the paywall knowledge finder, which is an incredible treasure trove of archives going back to the 1940s of international best practices, case studies, and so forth that members have access to. So we encourage you to become a member. Good afternoon. My name is Richard Joy, Executive Director of ULI Toronto, and welcome to our third webinar in our 5-part webinar series. This one, Demand Side, examining the under-discussed side of supply and demand. For this, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. As a Toronto region-based organization, we acknowledge that the land we are meeting on virtually is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are all treaty people. Many of us have come here as settlers, immigrants, and newcomers in this generation or generations past. ULI stands in solidarity with Indigenous communities demanding action and accountability for the ongoing legacy of the residential school system. We'd like to also acknowledge and honor those who've come here involuntarily, particularly descendants from those who brought here through enslavement. To better understand the meaning behind this land acknowledgement, we recommend 4 programs that we've uploaded to YouTube, and these links will be made available in the chat. Today's event and other ULI programming would just simply not be possible without the support of ULI's annual sponsors. And we would like to thank them all for that support. Now, more than ever, ULI relies on the support of our sponsors to put on high quality programs such as today and to drive our mission to shape the future of the built environment for transformative impact in communities worldwide. To all our sponsors, I say thank you. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Charisse Burda, Executive Director of City Building Research and Innovation at Toronto Metropolitan University, City Building Research and Innovation. Before I hand it over to Charisse, I want to make one note to our audience that ULI is a nonpartisan organization, and we do not advocate on public policy, pro or con. You will not see us taking positions on matters of, that are before us today, for example. But we do look at the public policy landscape and with a critical lens. And the reason for this 5-part series is just that, to examine the angles of really important public policy discussions as part of our advancement of our global mission. We have a jam-packed agenda today, so unfortunately we won't have time for audience Q&A. But with that, Charisse, and your more full introduction, your bio is in the chat, as will the other panelists be made available as well. So Charisse, over to you, and I'll see you at the end.
Thank you, Richard, and thanks to ULI for this excellent week-long program on the affordable housing crisis. If you tuned in yesterday, it was a super exciting discussion on supply. And today we're going to spend some time focusing on the under-discussed demand factors, how these are contributing to the affordable housing crisis, how these may be impacting rental or ownership differently, and how changes to government policies and programs can address certain demand factors and promote affordability. So we have a really fantastic panel who are known for their data-driven research. So each panelist will be making opening remarks with the aid of their most excellent graphs and other visuals, and then we will have a moderated discussion. So to save time for discussion, I will not be making lengthy introductions. Each of the panelists' bios will be shared in the chat. So let's begin by introducing the panel. Sean Hildebrand is president of Urban Nation. Tobias Orwell is vice president investment, Tricon Residential. And John Pasalis is president and broker of Realosophy Realty. And Steve Pomeroy is industry professor and executive advisor at McMaster University, Canadian Housing Evidence Collaborative, and senior research fellow at Carleton University. All right, let's begin with the opening comments from each of you on demand factors and how these are impacting housing affordability. Steve, let's kick off the data dive with you.
Great, thanks, Charisse, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all today to talk about this. And I agree, the demand side has to some extent been relegated relative to the discussion on supply. Next slide. What I want to talk about are sort of three aspects of demand, and I like to distinguish between the quantity of demand, how many people do we have actually seeking housing, as well as the quality of demand, who are they and what is their capacity to pay. And I think these have very significant impacts in terms of pressures on price and rents. Next slide. Just to begin with the quantity, I mean, what we've really seen is that much of the discourse has said we have this chronic shortage, or we have this undersupply, and I think what's really happening is that we have we do not have enough supply, but it's really been caused, and the problem has been seriously exacerbated in the last 5 years by a massive surge in growth, largely from immigration. Our natural growth is actually very tiny nationally, and in Ontario, most of our growth comes from immigration, and within our cities and within our provinces, interprovincial and intra-provincial migration is a big part of that. What this chart is showing us, and it's Ontario rather than Toronto specifically, but the pattern is very similar in Toronto, is this massive surge, and we kind of see a big growth of the green is the international migration, and the purpley, whatever color that happens to be, is this thing called non-permanent residence. It's something we don't really sort of recognize very much, but these are temporary foreign workers and international students. Temporary foreign workers are quite a small part of it. The vast majority are international students, and this is largely a function of constrained funding for universities. And the only source of new funding for universities is to go out and attract and recruit international students who come directly into the rental market. So this really has a very significant impact on the rental market. 2021, Canada approved study visas for 600,000 international students. That has a massive impact on our rental markets, and particularly small cities, Kingstons, the Peterboroughs of the world, that have relatively small rental stocks and are impacted by that kind of newcomer. And the reality is, as demand has increased, we all know that housing is inherently the supply elasticity of housing is very, very low. People can get on a plane this morning and arrive tonight. We can't produce a house for 3 or 4 years. So that's the real conundrum that we have there. So that's really the quantity. Next slide. On the quality piece, this is not news to anybody, but I think it's an important feature of the demand side. And we've seen relatively steady growth in incomes and dramatic decline in interest rates. Next slide. When we put these two things together, the combination, for every dollar of income at the prevailing interest rate in any 1 year creates the capacity to pay a leverage effect. And on the one hand, while observers have expressed concern about the widening gap between incomes and prices, the reality is, because of the growth of income and because of the dramatic decline in interest rates, the leverage effect of the average household is actually very, very strong. And in this, on the right-hand side, the gray line is the leverage effect. The orange line is prices. And what we can see is that for the average consumer, their capacity to pay and their capacity to borrow has exceeded the home price, and therefore it's these consumers that have actually pulled prices up. It's not that they're being pushed up, they're being pulled up by capacity to pay, particularly by a small number of households who are active in the market in any 1 year. We sell around about 700,000 homes between resales and new construction. That's only about 5% of households in the country. So a very, very small number of households can have a very, very big effect in the marketplace. Next slide. The other part that's happened is we've seen very, very substantial increases in home prices over the last few years, particularly. And what we see in this chart is the total amount of residential mortgage debt, which is just under $2 billion, the orange line, the amount of equity that the 10.5 million homeowners in the country actually own, and the gray bars are the amount of equity they've accumulated. And we've seen a dramatic increase in the amount of equity in the last number of years, the aggregate amount of equity growing by over $4 trillion, 8 times the rate of growth in debt. So people have accumulated, appreciation begets more appreciation. And as I mentioned, the small number of households that are active in the market where they have these massive amounts of equity available to them, 2/3 to 3/4 of buyers are existing owners, and they're using these sort of bags of money, if you will, to help them either buy investment properties or change their place of residence in the market. And it's very, very difficult for first-time buyers who are scraping together a down payment to compete against these folks who have massive amounts of purchasing power as a consequence of benefiting from price appreciation. So it really has, to some extent, distorted the price pressures in the marketplace. Next slide. So just to conclude, really, I mean, the point of this panel is that, yeah, absolutely, we need supply to keep up with growth, but it's really demand factors that have a bigger influence on prices and rents. Certainly, with the federal government having announced quite high immigration targets for the next few years, 550,000 permanent residents across the country, clearly this is not going to slow down. In fact, it's going to increase. But at the same time, while we do need to increase supply, increasing supply alone won't necessarily address the more fundamental problem which people are talking about, which is affordability of housing. And it's currently, and as Robert Kasich said yesterday, I mean, really, Tiff Macklin and the Bank of Canada are probably doing the most work in this area in terms of correcting for price by raising the cost of borrowing and reversing that leverage trend that I showed earlier. So my concluding point is really that we don't just need any new supply. We have to be quite specific about what type of supply, what built form, who we're targeting, and the kind of price and rent levels that's involved in that. And clearly, once we get down to the low income folks who are under extreme stress, there's a clear role for public policy to address their inability to actually have effective demand in the marketplace. So I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks, Steve. Over to you, John.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. So I mean, I found the title of this this session interesting, the undiscussed side of supply and demand, which is interesting because, when we look at the factors that drive house prices up, I mean, the most basic ones, interest rates and the, change in credit that goes along with that, population growth, and then new completions in terms of supply. The only variable that really hasn't changed very much over the past 20 years, quite frankly, is supply. I mean, when we look at the other variables, interest rate, credit growth, and population growth, I mean, those have exploded. So it's quite odd. I find it odd, at least, to hear that, a lot of people argue that the fundamental cause of what we're experiencing today in our housing market is the supply issue, when obviously the big factors that are changing are all demand driven. So we clearly have a massive growth in demand caused by population growth and declining interest rates, and certainly supply isn't keeping up. But is supply alone enough to catch up with demand? And I think it's not. And without getting into the macro questions of whether they can or not, which were discussed yesterday, I mean, I thought I'd take a more micro look at sort of a misunderstanding, I think, that some of the supply advocates have about what's needed and what the problems are. And this next slide has, one of the policy recommendations from the Housing Affordability Task Force to allow as of right residential housing up to 4 units and up to 4 stories. The idea here is that, the gap is that there are so many people who want to build multiplex homes that they're just not allowed. And if we legalize this missing middle type of housing, we'll see this sea of multiplexes being built, and it'll help contribute to our housing affordability crisis. But when you look on the ground, that's actually not what's happening. That's not where the demand is. But when you look at what's happening, this next photo, which is a tweet that kind of made the rounds in the past week, is more an example of what's actually happening on the ground, that more and more people are actually taking existing multiplexes and converting them to single family homes. So legalizing multiplexes in and of itself will not result in a massive boom in new starts or conversions to fourplexes. So why are people converting multiplexes to single family homes? And I think there are 2 primary reasons. I mean, for starters, this next slide shows the number of completions for low-rise homes in the GTA. So our population's exploding, and we're not building family-sized homes, and I focused on low-rise because, the average size for condominiums now is probably 600 square feet or 6 and change, and that's not big enough for families. So, not only are we not building enough, low-rise or I should say family-sized home. It doesn't matter if they're low-rise, but the point is family-sized homes. We're not building enough for our population growth. But on top of that, the stock of existing family-sized homes that is available to be bought by end users and families is actually shrinking over time, because more and more of them are going into the hands of investors, both small investors and institutional. And this next slide has a quote from our housing minister, who argues that, small-time landlords provide rental stock to Canadian families and individuals. So we need to, we don't want to negatively affect them because they're actually providing rental service. I mean, this, quite frankly, is a very silly argument. I mean, the investors are not solving our housing crisis. I mean, what they're doing is, and our housing minister is an investor. I think he owns a townhome in Ottawa suburbs. I mean, and by owning it, what's happening, and when you do this on scale, is the investors are taking homes that were intended to be owner occupied. They're taking them out of the market. They're basically using them as assets. So there are fewer homes for people to buy, which drives prices up and actually creates rental demand. And we can kind of see this on the ground. So if we look at, I work with MLS data because I'm in the real estate brokerage industry. And when we look at some statistics and we say, okay, how many homes each year were either bought and converted to rentals by investors, or that were likely owner occupied for a number of years, and then after the owner moved out, they converted them to a rental property. This next slide shows those numbers on an annual basis, and we can kind of see that they've exploded, from around 3,000 in 2006, to close to 14,000 in the peak. So what we're seeing here is tens of thousands of homes every year that are basically converted to rental properties, right? And what this is doing effectively in our next slide is it's one of the reasons why our home ownership rate is actually declining over time, because fewer homes are available to be bought by end user families. Those families are getting pushed into the rental market. It's driving house prices up. And again, this isn't, I don't see this kind of very neoliberal vision that our governments are putting forward as a solution to either market rate housing or market rents. And of course, obviously not deeply affordable housing either. So I think we're going to have a lot of challenges in the future, and I don't think they can all be met with strictly supply solutions. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks a lot, John. And I think Tobias is next. Yes.
Yep.
Great.
Thanks, Therese. So I think to a certain extent, our housing affordability problem is certainly, it's not easy to solve, but it's not that hard to understand either. And it's all relatively simple math. So I'm going to be repeating a lot of the concepts that were already brought up here, like the amount of people and their capacity to pay, family size units. But as a developer of purpose-built rentals myself, I'm going to look at the overall drivers of housing demand, but I'm going to focus on distinguishing rental demand drivers from for sale demand drivers and how that has helped shape our built environment. And I'm going to focus particularly on Toronto. So next slide, please. I think the first overall point that I'd like to make, and that everyone has been making, is that demand is composed of not just people, but basically money. So it's on the rental side, it's households and cash. And on the for sale side, it's households and cash, but then you have to add in credit and government subsidies into the mix. And to put a finer point on the number of people, I think the headline stories of immigration and population growth continue to be important. But at the end of the day, there are demographic and economic forces that are shaping household formation that are more long-term and that the government can't really affect in the same way that it does our immigration numbers. I'm thinking of things like the average household size that's been gradually and steadily decreasing over time in Canada as people form households later in life or not at all, and as they have fewer children. The cash piece of the equation is relatively simple. It's effectively the labor market and wages. And then we get into the demand drivers that affect for sale housing specifically. So both John and Steve touched on the credit market, and I think we all have a firsthand experience of what's going on in the last 6 to 8 months as increasing mortgage rates have affected people's ability to buy homes. And then finally, on the demand side subsidies for sale housing, we have subsidies provided by the government. And we've decided as a society that home ownership should be encouraged, and we subsidize this through a variety of subsidies and tax incentives. And all these demand drivers have an overlay of psychology and emotion and human behavior at the end of the day as well. And these are not as easy to quantify, but I think we'd all agree that, as we saw in the last couple of years on the way up, the for sale market is fueled by a certain amount of FOMO and classic inflationary spiral dynamics where people rush to buy now to avoid future price increases. Another hard to quantify but real phenomenon is the presence of fraud and the lack of enforcement of existing rules in our system. Falsification of sources of income, exaggeration of loan documents, these are all increasing access to credit and fueling demand for sale housing. So if we go to the next slide and we go back to our Econ 101 textbooks, we'll remember that all these demand drivers don't move us up and down on the demand curve, but they shift the whole curve itself. So if we think of this first graph as the baseline equilibrium price established by the intersection of supply and demand, We can take a quick look at the supply constraints that we're all familiar with and that were discussed yesterday. So next slide, please. So hard and soft cost inflation, long entitlement durations, lack of as of right density options, all these things constrain the supply of housing and shift the curve left, decreasing the number of housing units that are built and raising the price for those that are. And on the next slide, we'll take a look at the for sale housing demand drivers and all the things that I mentioned earlier, number of households, labor market, cheap credit, FOMO and fraud. All these things shift the demand curve, raising the price per unit of housing and theoretically making it economical for builders to deliver more supply to meet that demand. If we go to the next slide, we'll see the same thing, but for the rental market. And again, we're looking at households and cash. But I think it's important to point out that if a household that's in the for sale market fails to purchase a unit, that doesn't decrease the overall demand for housing. It just moves that household from the for sale market into the rental market. And that's likely what we're seeing right now, right? As people get priced out of home purchases with rising interest rates, and they're looking for rentals now when they maybe prefer to own a home. So demand in the rental market is also affected by the amount of options in the for sale market. And on the next slide, we'll talk about the inelasticity of supply of housing, which Steve mentioned earlier on. So that means that the supply curve is steep because you can't just turn it on and off. So in the previous graph, a shift in the demand curve would mean an increase in prices, with builders being incentivized to increase supply. But now with a steep inelastic curve, prices move up more quickly than increases in the quantities of housing units. And so these are, of course, conceptual, simplified models of supply and demand, but I think they're helpful in illustrating the interaction between the two and the dynamics of how prices move up and down. And the final point that I'd like to make is that housing tenure, that is owning or renting a home, it's a personal or cultural preference. Some people value the flexibility of renting and some value the stability of owning. Some people don't like mowing lawns and shoveling snow, and some people are okay with it. And I don't believe that there's anything inherently good about home ownership, and the usual justifications for home ownership, whether they be increased civic participation or the supposed benefits to children growing up in owned homes, these are ultimately classist. The financial outperformance of homes, while real, only exists because of the supply imbalance relative to demand. If there were true balance in the market, there would be no reason that home prices should grow at a faster rate than regular inflation. And so as a homeowner myself, I'm certainly not arguing against home ownership. What I am arguing for is a system where people can choose to rent or own the full spectrum of housing types, and where home ownership is not subsidized by taxpayers, and where the burden of that subsidy falls on renters who do not even benefit from those subsidies, and where those renters are largely low income and people of color. In the case of Toronto, as we see on the next slide, the subsidies for home ownership have resulted in condo development wildly skewed towards units with fewer bedrooms, shifting the supply curve for family-sized units left and making the city increasingly unaffordable for families. And so this is all to say that there's a myriad of macroeconomic forces that shape demand, but there are also forces within our control that are distorting the demand side of the housing market, and that we as a society have the ability to change. And with that, I'll pass it on to Sean.
Great. Yeah, sorry. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to participate in this panel. There's been a lot of great content shared so far, a lot of interesting slides and data presented, and hopefully I can contribute to that a bit. It's interesting to me as someone who tracks new development activity very closely, how the discourse in the market has shifted so much towards the supply side recently, which it's definitely important. But when it comes to new development, when talking about supply issues, you're also really talking about demand issues as well. And this is because of the way we build in the GTA. Consider that condos represent about 2/3 of all housing development in the region. There's now almost 100,000 condos that are under construction across the GTA right now, plus another 30,000 or so units in pre-construction sales that'll be starting construction soon. We now have over 2,000 condo buildings completed in the GTA, and that's totaling over 400,000 units. So the condo market is massive. it's actually larger than the number of purpose-built rentals that we have in the GTA right now. And that is a very significant milestone that really tells the story of how the GTA landscape has evolved over the last decade, right? And investors own about 40% of the total condo stock. They represent about 60, 70% of new condo buyers. So when we talk about supply in the GTA, we're also talking about demand. And we're also in particular talking about investor demand. And in doing so, we're also talking about future rental supply. So, you know, you can try to help developers on their costs and their construction speed. But if investors aren't interested in buying, ultimately, it's going to impede on new development. Next slide, please. We've recently released some reports on the new development market that have made quite a few headlines. The first being the sharp pullback in new condo sales and pre-sale launches recently, which is a function of demand, investor demand, but also high development costs today that are impacting the volume of new projects being brought to pre-sale, and that will eventually impact supply in the future. And with the region's key engine of housing supply growth in condos set to slow down, unfortunately, there's nothing else that's been picking up the slack. Rental projects are also finding it unfeasible to proceed. The new low-rise home sales have all but vanished. And on top of this, as we've heard from the other panelists, we now have a target for immigration that will reach 500,000 in a few years. That is an extra 200,000 people per year above what the country normally brings in as new immigrants, not to mention non-permanent residents, which provides a pretty clear picture of what the housing landscape is going to look like in a few years. Now, there's obviously a lot of efforts to raise supply through new housing bills, but I can assure you that there is almost nothing that the government can do to correct this situation in the next few years. Supply is a slow-moving machine, and it takes time to turn around. In the meantime, next slide, please. The conversation around housing is and will continue to be dominated by high interest rates, still high home prices, and the combination of the two has caused ownership affordability to reach what is perhaps a record low, right? Worse than in the early 90s, worse than in the early 80s when interest rates were in the double digits, when you measure the percentage of income eaten up by mortgage payments associated with buying the average price home. Now, you can sort of overlay these two charts together and see a very clear negative correlation here. And this is quite clearly causing a sharp reduction in home ownership affordability as viewed through the latest census data that we've recently received. And this shows home ownership in the GTA falling continuously over the last 10 years. It's now down to a 20-year low. It's pretty clear to us that this trend will continue in the next 10 years. So we need, as an industry, to get prepared, right? The government can't really control interest rates. I mean, it's quasi-government, it's the Bank of Canada, it's certainly the job of monetary policy, but they can influence what type of housing we build. The reliance on condos for new developments and investors for new condo demand, it's worked very well in a low interest rate, high price growth environment. And investors have done very, very well over the last 10 years, which is why we have so many of them. Next chart, please. But as you can see in the data, things are shifting quickly. New condo sales in the third quarter were down nearly 80% year over year. Outside of the first few months of the pandemic, this was the lowest volume of new condo sales since the financial crisis in early 2009. As you can see from the chart on the right, absorption rates for new launches fell to a near record low. And it really just shows how difficult the current environment is for developers to sell. And this time, you know, we don't have the ability to quickly recover by dropping interest rates, given the inflation fighting course that we seem to be on. You know, it's only 1 quarter of data for sure, but it seems unlikely we will be moving back to previous highs for new condo sales in the near term. So what does this mean? What does this change in demand mean for the market? Next slide, please. Well, there's about a 12-month lag between new condo sales and construction starts. So by around mid next year, we'll start to see condo construction levels fall in the GTA meaningfully for the first time in decades. And this is important given how much weight condos carry, not only to to housing supply, but also broader economic activity in the region. And then in about 4 to 5 years' time, the hit to completions will come, right? Which is when the real impact of the slowdown in condo sales will be felt. In the meantime, however, it will feel like we're building a lot because that record number of units that are under construction right now will bring about more completions. Supply in the near term will benefit from past strength in condo demand. Actually, next year we're expecting about 30,000 condo completions. Well, it'll make for a record year, but I believe it's masking what is actually happening behind the scenes. If you flip to the next slide, please, you'll see that the eventual slowdown in condo supply, it's going to hit the rental market the hardest. The latest census data showed us that close to 60% of newly completed condos are used as rentals. And you can see from the chart there that just how much that share has grown over the past 10 years and just how important condo investors are to supplying the region with new rental supply. So as much as we need investors to continue buying new condos to supply rental units into the future, the economics of doing so right now just don't work as well anymore. Next slide, please. And this is really because of how sticky new condo prices are due to high costs. And you can see how that compares to the current trends for resale prices. Investors would need to pay a record high premium over resale units in today's market if they're looking to buy as an investment. And this is fine if you believe that the value of the unit will appreciate by more than 30 to 40% over the next few years while the unit's in development. But given the current landscape, not many are willing to take that bet right now. Next slide, please. And on top of this, you have a record wide gap that has opened up between the cost of owning and the cost of renting the same condo unit, which creates a situation effectively where most investors will face negative cash flow. And at the same time, this is putting a lot of upward pressure on rental demand, right? As the economics of renting become much more favorable and a greater proportion of would-be first-time buyers are locked out of the market, you see a lot more demand filtering into rentals. And this is demand from higher income individuals who would have otherwise purchased. So you have more money, more people, as Tobias was talking about, chasing basically a stagnant supply of new rentals. And this creates a big conundrum for the market. We know rental demand will rise with higher immigration and reduced ownership affordability. But at the same time, supply will be moving in the opposite direction. Can you flip to the next slide, please? Higher interest rates and high development costs are not only impacting condo launches, but also rental construction starts. And this is happening after meaningful progress, I would say. Last year, in 2021, we reported a multi-decade high for rental starts at just over 7,500 units. Now, it wasn't enough to start filling the rental supply gap, but it was the most rental construction that we saw start in about 30 years, over 30 years, and it certainly was putting us on the right trajectory. It looked like a lot of promising new supply was getting into the pipeline. But this year so far, year-to-date starts for rentals have dropped 72% year over year. There's been basically no rental starts in the last 2 quarters. I think I can count maybe 2 projects that started since the first quarter. So against this backdrop of declining starts and obviously rising population, the housing supply deficit, whatever that number is, it's going to be bigger in the next few years. Population projections, next slide, please. Population projections made before the recent increase in immigration was calling for growth of 1.24 million residents in the GTA over the next 10 years. That's 50% higher than the previous 10-year growth, which was about 849,000. And it equals, if you take the average household size is around 2.5, it equals demographic demand for about 50,000 housing units or more per year. Whereas as you can see from the chart on the left, the current pace of building in the GTA is about 40,000 units, and it's trending down given the fact that we're seeing slower new condo launches and fewer rental construction starts. So this will be obviously particularly problematic for the rental market. As we know, the majority of new immigrants that come into the GTA tend to rent, and renter household formation is already accelerating much faster than ownership household formation. Next slide, please. And in fact, renter household formation in the GTA is rising 3.5 times faster than the rate of ownership household formation. However, the stock of rentals has basically been stagnant, right? If you look at 26% growth in rental household formation over the last 10 years, the number of purpose-built rentals in the GTA has increased by less than 5%. And I'll cap off my comments just with the chart on the right there that shows the challenges that developers face in meeting demand, as it takes on average 100 months to bring a project from application submission to completion. And as you can see, it's not just approvals and permitting delays, but it's also labor capacity. It's construction innovation, right? It takes the same amount of time to build a building today as it has, over the last 30, 40 years. And this is really slowing things down. It's a very, very complex issue. I don't think it's going to be solved in the near term, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, everybody. We have that was so incredible. I was taking notes furiously, and most of you have already answered the questions that I had for you today, but I've written down new ones. And we've got about 20 minutes. So I'm going to ask that, even though I'm trying to get through a lot of questions, if we could try and answer them pretty quickly so we can move on to new ones. But so John, I hope it's okay to start with you. Over the past several years, I have followed your super insightful research that you've been doing, tracking tons of data, in particular, tracking a lot of investor activity and its impact on housing prices in the GTA over time. So could you please talk a little bit about how significant a role investors have had on demand and ultimately on housing affordability, and what you think this looks like going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's been quite interesting, actually, because I think Toronto is quite unique compared to a lot of other places. I mean, usually when we look at investor demand, there's these big bursts and it's speculative, kind of like in the US during the financial crisis. But right now, Torontonians are real estate obsessed because, I mean, it's been the best investment. I mean, you're leveraged, 80%, and you're making 10% per year on your 20% down payment. Like, you cannot beat those returns. And, on top of that, people are looking at what's going on. And this is why no one, like, the first question we get on the ground when people want to move to another home, it's, can I keep my current home as a rental property? Like, always, it's like 90% of people is this first question they ask. And if they can, they just hold it, right? And again, like I think Tobias mentioned, like, at the end of the day, as long as they're renting it, I mean, sure, they're renting it, it's providing rental stock, but at the end of the day, what this is end up doing is it's just driving up prices, right? Because you have more well-capitalized people who are taking this stock, aren't renting it.
Okay, I think John is stalled, or am I the person who is stalled?
Yeah, no, I think John is stalled.
Okay.
Oh,
I might just jump.
All right.
Thanks, John. I'm going to jump to Sean to sort of riff on that. Sean, you gave us like so much information on where investors are at, how it's going to affect the rental market, how it's going to affect supply in general with these market conditions. There's so many different factors at play. I'm curious what you think going forward is going to happen. Are we just going to sort of pause, skip a beat and then go back to the way that condos have moved forward with, as you described, 40 to 50% of that demand coming from investors, providing that rental supply? Or do you think investors might start to move to the resale market given the delta in those prices that you illustrated?
I think the condo market has evolved a lot over the last 10 years, and I think it's going to continue to evolve. One of the interesting things that's come through the data in the last couple of years is that the majority of new condo sales and the majority of new condo development right now in the GTA is not in the city of Toronto. It's in the 905. So I think investors have adjusted to high prices, and obviously they're starting to look at higher interest rates to sort of orient themselves towards what they consider to be value sites. So those areas of the market that could be potentially higher growth areas, and also, provide better potential rental yields and returns on investment. Because, buying in the downtown core at today's average price per square foot, I mean, minimum entry-level unit is like $1 million. Okay, so a lot of investors are saying, okay, I'm not paying that. Even if it's a 400 square foot unit, it's $1 million at the end of the day. And that gap between resale just keeps growing and growing. And the rents, even though they've shot up 20% year over year, they're probably not going to continue at that pace. So I'm looking at a situation where the return on investment isn't going to be quite as strong. So interestingly, the development is starting to move into these areas of the 905 that have been completely devoid of rental supply. Like we don't build much rental supply generally in Toronto, but in the suburbs, it's almost completely lacking. So I think investors are serving a pretty strong purpose by bringing that supply into more suburban markets. And obviously, there's been a change in living habits due to COVID-19 that is starting to sort of spread demand for high-rise living across the region too. But what I will say is that new immigration can't be understated as a factor for new condo demand. We have a lot of conversations with not only developers but brokers and agents that are operating day to day in the market, and they tell us just how important new immigration is for new condo demand. Now, I think we're all sort of aware of the fact that pure foreign demand represents a fairly small proportion of overall condo sales in the GTA. These would be individuals that are sort of overseas and speculating on Toronto condos. It's a very small proportion. It always has been. But the proportion of foreign wealth that drives condo demand is very significant. So immigrants that are coming over, bringing over family money, they have a bias towards real estate. They favor condo investments. And I wouldn't count condo investment out because of that fact. I think there's still a critical mass out there of investors who know another person who's interested in investing and is bringing over another family member who's interested in investing. Like I said, there's over 400,000 condos in the GTA, which means there's hundreds of thousands of condos and condo investors as well. So I think that's an engine of the market that it's experiencing some slowdown now, but I wouldn't count it out for sure.
Okay, great. Super fascinating. I'm going to switch gears, go over to Steve, and then to you, Tobias. So Steve, your one graph where you showed the portion of non-permanent residents, international students, I thought was fascinating. 600,000 visas annually. So I really enjoyed the chat that you and I had last week when you were talking about the demand pressures caused just by students, competing with the same product as a young professional, right? Like a condo. So can you talk a little bit about that and some of your thoughts on potential solutions to address student demand and how it could have like a big impact and relieves the pressure valve?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, and as I mentioned, it gets exacerbated in small markets. I happened to be doing some work in Kingston a few years ago, and the vacancy rate there dropped from 2.9% to 0.6. The mayor got all excited, struck a task force, and off they went. But they forgot to look at the data. I went in and said, why did the vacancy rate drop? Turned out Queens had basically increased their enrollment of international students by 2,000 students a year for 2 years in a row in a market that has 16,000 units, not rocket science. And I think what tends to happen, and this is prevalent across all markets with universities, in particular smaller towns where the university is a big part of the local economy. And what these students obviously are looking for affordable housing, and they tend to push out those folks living in the more affordable stock. So it has massive impacts on our concerns for lower level affordability. At the same time, what we're seeing in some cities, Waterloo in particular, there's a couple of new developments in Ottawa where developers have actually started building purpose-built student housing, and it's a built form where you've kind of got 4 students with a private bed private bathroom in a quad unit with a shared living room, shared kitchen, and the rents per square foot on that kind of product pencil out very, very strongly relative to regular rentals. So if we could, you use the LCFI money, for example, if CMHC said to developers, we want you to actually build some student housing, it doesn't even need partnerships with universities. You can do it off campus. Partnerships with universities with land would make it even better. But if we could, in Queen's case, if they could have avoided those 2,000 students coming into the local rental market, it would have a very, very positive impact on moderating the impact that they're having on the rental market. So I think we need to start thinking about, as I say, passing up who are these 550,000 immigrants and the additional non-permanent residents, and what kind of distinct segments of the market can we identify, and then try to create solutions that actually target them better. And the students one would be a very big one to look at.
Yeah, super interesting. Tobias, I'm interested in your response to that from a developer. Does that look like an opportunity to you? So I'll quickly ask you that, and then I wanted to ask you a bigger question.
Yeah, I think purpose-built student housing is just another sort of derivative of multifamily rentals that's required to help ease the pressure on the system in general. Like I said, what we need is a full spectrum of housing options to rent and a full spectrum of housing options to own, because those two things should be, at the end of the day, just a preference of people, and you should be able to do what you want, and you should be able to have access to whatever you want. So purpose-built student housing sort of takes the pressure off of the traditional housing market, and hopefully in the best executed cases caters to students and what they want, which is relatively specific and not what a traditional multifamily building is looking for. Hopefully they're closer to universities themselves, campuses themselves, and cuts down on congestion and traffic in the surrounding cities. And I think other sort of derivatives of multifamily that can do similar things are co-living and other sort of creative multifamily living options, so that people aren't just looking at 1-bedrooms and 1+ dens that are being churned out at a rate of 51% of the condo development that's happening in a city like Toronto.
Wow, that's very helpful comments. Yeah, I think it's a really cool idea. I know my students are looking for that. John, over to you. Over the years, as you know, because you follow this stuff, various levels of government in Toronto, Ontario, federally, or out in BC have tried all kinds of things to address affordability, whether it's a speculator tax or a vacant home tax, or first-time homebuyer incentive, or rent to own, or whatever the program of the day is, right? In your experience, and some of those have backfired, right, and created more demand or froth in the market. I just want to use the word froth. Yeah. But in your opinion and experience, which strategies have actually worked, and what hasn't, and what's the best of that we might want to be taking forward in the demand?
I mean, nothing clearly has worked, because our housing market's absolutely ridiculously expensive. I mean, the stress test has been a good policy to, obviously, that was a macro-prudential policy really geared towards financial stability for the bank. That wasn't really designed to improve our housing market, but obviously was a very good strategy. It did affect, because it allowed people, it constrained credit growth to some extent. But from my perspective, you can't solve this issue when you're supercharging our housing market with demand, right? And I've always felt that, there needs to be a closer connection between population growth, both through immigration and non-permanent residents, with housing completions. The fact is, the lever that government policymakers are easier to pull are on the, non-permanent resident immigration growth. They cannot control supply. We know what supply is coming down the pipeline. We know what completions are like, because houses and condos are started and are built years before they're done. So I do think we need a greater connection between those two things if we're going to fix it with supply. I mean, as Sean said, supply is a very slow moving solution. You need to change policy. It takes years for supply to grow. So my feeling is I think our population growth should be in line with our completions if we're going to get anywhere close to, addressing these issues.
Thanks, John. Steve, I'm going to talk about, I know this is a demand panel, but I'm going to talk about supply. The supply panel yesterday talked about demand, so we're allowed. But just really quickly, as you know, we have a supply target in Ontario of 1.5 million homes in over 10 years. I'm curious what the demand side evidence is to support that target. And in particular, is there like a blanket demand for this quantum, or are we looking at lots of demand for specific types of housing that is lacking?
Sorry, your mute problem. It's a bit of both, I think. But I think, if we look at others on the panel of reference, average household size, it's coming down. We're about 2.45, I think, nationally now. And I haven't so much looked at the Ontario numbers, but the national numbers, the 550,000 target of new immigrants, that would require us to build about 220,000 units a year in terms of at 2.4 persons per household, significantly less than we built in 2021, which was a record year, but significantly more than the average of the previous decade. So I think if we could just sort of keep up with what we want to do, the federal target is 3.5 million homes, the equivalent to the Ontario 1.5, which would be 350,000 a year, which I think is, excessive relative to what we need from a purely demographic point of view. Of course, there is the issue of a lot of development, particularly when it's intensification in our inner cities, is actually removing units. So it's not a net, gain of 220,000. We have to discount that by demolitions. And in some cases, and particularly in the rental market, we're clearly losing a lot of units into the short-term rental market, which is another negative in terms of the total numbers. So I suspect, and in the Ontario case, 100,000, 120,000 is probably the right place to be. I don't think the 150,000 is absolutely critical. And this notion that if we just build that much supply, and the CMHC study that came out back in May that said, we need 3.5 million in order to drive prices back to the affordability level that we saw in 2004. Well, I'm sure all my colleagues on the panel would agree, and as Sean has pointed out, developers look at the absorption rate. If they can't sell the units, they're not going to build them. The industry is not going to drive the prices down by 40%, which is what the CMHC study showed if we actually built 3.5 million homes. So I think there's a bit of disconnect between some esoteric theory of supply and demand curves versus how the industry actually reacts to this kind of stuff and adapts to the prevailing demands and the level that they think they can potentially absorb.
Thanks, Steve. I'm looking at the clock. I know we have 3 minutes and Richard is totally going to cut us off. So I want to give a couple more minutes to Tobias and Sean to either comment on what you've heard, or Tobias, I was going to ask you if you wanted to give a few more specifics about the types of sort of priorities in budget and subsidies to ownership versus rental. And then Sean, I just wanted to give you the last word on what we've heard. So quickly, a minute from Tobias and then Sean. Okay, Richard? Great.
Yeah, I think, a lot of attention has been paid to the supply side benefits that are out there in subsidies, so changes in zoning, development charge rates, rental versus condo. But on the demand side, as far as I know, the only government subsidies and tax credits that are available to stimulate demand only stimulate home ownership demand. And those take the form of, the elimination of capital gains tax on your primary residence, first-time home buyer credits, federal mortgage insurance and stuff like that. All of those things are spurring or bolstering home ownership. And again, I think everyone who wants to own a home should be able to. But if you take the economic outperformance or the financial outperformance of home ownership out of the equation, I think that, who would want to own a home would look very different, right? Because then you're faced with flexibility versus mobility, the upkeep of a home or a condo and stuff like that. So, yeah, like I said, the demand side subsidies are really take the form of foregone taxes, and everyone in the country bears the brunt of that, whether you own a home or not, and not everyone benefits from it right
Okay,
now.
great, Tobias. So Sean, I think you've
30
got
seconds.
30 seconds.
30
Last
seconds.
last word to you.
Okay, I'll just say that, you know, Toronto is very unique in its model for housing supply in the context of North America, where if you go to any other large city, the majority of new supply being built is rental. It's not ownership condo. Now we've been very fortunate because condo investors ultimately add their units to the rental pool, but not having, you know, the right mix of rental really impedes overall housing supply and housing choice within the marketplace. So I think you know, recognizing that condo investors are scaling back, we need to do whatever we can to ramp up efforts to build new purpose-built rental supply. So any incentive that can help in that regard, because there's a lot of talk about ramping up supply. I don't see much specific as it relates to rental. I think that's the solution, because if the average income required to buy the average priced home in the GTA is $150,000 or more, you know, the de facto affordable rental, de facto affordable housing supply is new rental. So I think that's sort of my final comment.
Thank you. And Cerise, thank you very much. That was an incredible job of covering a lot of ground with this amazing panel. And it was rather a cruel thing to ask you all to do this within an hour. So I apologize, but Sean, Tobias, Steve, and John, that was amazing. That was an incredible contribution to this week-long series. You can see on the screen, there's upcoming events that you can absorb with some details in the chat, but in the interest of time, we always end on time at ULI. I will say good afternoon. Thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you all tomorrow. Goodbye.
You're welcome.